most of you know, my dad was a prisoner of war, World War II, 3.5 years, in the Japanese prison camp. And every year I tell you about one of the great joys and memories I have of my dad is sitting around the dinner table, hearing stories. And I miss it. But there was also somebody else at that table who has his own stories. And I haven't said thank you enough to him, because I sure didn't say thank you enough to my dad. This person sat at that table. He served in Vietnam, 1968, 69, 2 tours. He is now retired and living in California, in a little resort town of 300 people, with his beautiful wife, Carol, and his 2 dogs. And it's my honor and pleasure to have my brother here today. From the 282nd Aviation Sport Detachment, 3rd Platoon, Alley Cats, Marble Mountain, Da Nang, Vietnam. Please welcome Paul W. Keenan.
Boy, is this humbling. Before I get started, I want y'all to know something. This is a big deal to me today. To be invited to speak to you on a day that you honor veterans, Veterans Day. It's a big deal to me. So thank you for asking me to come speak to you. Today I'm going to talk to you about stories. It's interesting that Scott mentioned that, because that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, is stories. You see, I believe everybody has them. Everybody has a story. Stories that consist of events in their lives that dictate who they are and help you understand why they do the things that they do. I'm going to talk to you about 3 stories today, 3 stories in particular. Story number 1 is going to be about my dad, our dad. As Scott said, our dad was a decorated World War II veteran. He served in the 200th Coast Artillery. It was a National Guard unit out of New Mexico. He was sent to the Philippines and was serving there when on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Immediately after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese focused their attention on the Philippines. After approximately 4 months of resisting and fighting, our troops were emaciated from malnutrition, disease, and sickness. They had been virtually cut off from all supplies for that entire 4 months. They developed a motto for themselves to illustrate their plight. The motto was, no mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. The battling bastards of Japan. On April 8, 1942, the troops surrendered to the Japanese in the Philippines. The next day, our men began a march, a forced march through dust, agony, and death. The march was called the Bataan Death March. Approximately, estimates vary, but approximately 11,000 men lost their lives on that march alone. Those that survived, well, their nightmare of captivity had really just begun. They were then herded into cattle cars, so tightly that many suffocated on their feet, and they were transported to camps where they were subjected to unspeakable cruelty, disease, and sickness. After that was over, and as the Allied troops began to close in on the Japanese, they were herded into hell ships, unmarked ships that were targets for American Allied submarines as they were headed to Korea and Japan. You know, very few survived that, but my dad was one of them. And as we grow up, as I grew up with him, he never talked about being a soldier. He never talked about his experience as a POW. And I think as kids, we all have expectations of our parents, of what we expect from them, what we want from them. And I was no exception to that. There were times when I think I wanted more from my dad than he was able to give me, or perhaps could. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that he came to me one day and he handed me a book. The book was called Some Survive. It was an account, a detailed account of the Bataan Death March, and the experiences of the POWs during the Bataan Death March and until their liberation at the end of the war. And I have to say that in reading that book, it became glaringly apparent to me for the first time what a remarkable man. He was. That it wasn't about that he couldn't give us more after all that he had been through. It was that he gave us so much, given all that he had been through. But you see, the important thing here is that for me to understand my dad, I needed to understand a little bit more about his story. Story number 2. The year is 1967. I'm going to talk to you about me for just a second. I enlisted in the Army, and after some training, I was sent straight to Vietnam.